The room felt paused, as if the dust had memorized its own slow descent and refused to land. A half-collapsed curtain hung against the window, letting in a thin line of morning light that cut across the old floorboards like a reminder of something unfinished. The air smelled of sun-warmed wood and paper left too long without a reader. It was the kind of place where silence had a contour, and every object seemed to breathe with the same quiet pulse. When investigator Caleb Mercer stepped inside again after 2 decades, the space received him without surprise, only recognition, a stillness shaped by memory. He paused just past the doorway. His exhale was controlled, quiet, barely more than a shift in the air. The room was almost exactly as he remembered. The table where the report had first been written, the corner where the original kit had rested in a sealed box, and near the far wall, the outline of where she had been found that morning in 2001. Daria Linwood, 23, a part-time art student who worked evenings at a bookstore 2 towns over. He let the name cross his mind like a fragile artifact, not spoken, just held. The scene was clean now, long cleared, but the faint geometry of the original investigation lingered like a faint afterimage. Caleb stepped forward, running a slow hand along the surface of the nearest shelf. Dust shifted in a soft ripple. It clung to his fingertips, light, powdery, unbothered by the years. He brushed it away, then glanced at the case file tucked under his arm. The cover was a new print, crisp edges, fresh staples, but the contents were old, pages from a different decade. He dropped the file onto the small metal table and let it settle. The sound was quiet, a soft click, the kind of sound that carried more weight than volume. He pulled out the chair and sat, scanning the room again before opening the file. A faint breeze moved across the floor, whispering through a crack in the window frame. It carried the scent of dry sage from the desert outside, blending with the darker interior smell of dust and forgotten paper. Caleb opened the top sheet. Daria's photograph stared back, taken on a clear afternoon near the bookstore where she worked. Her posture relaxed, her expression steady, her dark hair pulled back with care. She had grown up in Sparks, studied part-time at the community college, rented a small apartment above a garage. A life quiet, simple, steady. The details gathered like small stones, ordinary but grounding. He remembered the morning he received the call in 2001. The early light, the drive out to this abandoned service building outside Reno, the uncertain tone in the deputy's voice. Back then, the building had been in worse shape. Broken boards, loose metal siding, debris scattered near the entrance. This room had been used for storage. Farming tools, empty crates, leftover equipment from a local property owner who later sold the land. She had been found near the back wall, positioned with a strange stillness that denied any clear narrative. Caleb pulled a fresh glove onto his right hand and reached into the file for the original scene photos. The prints had faded, edges curling slightly. He laid them out in a slow row. It was like reassembling a whisper, one breath at a time. The images captured angles that felt both familiar and distant, a detective's memory preserved through lenses weaker than the human mind but more exact. The way her hair had fanned slightly against the floor, the placement of her shoe near the broken crate. A scrap of fabric caught on a nail. His breath tightened subtly, not dramatic, not visible, just present. Back then, evidence had felt finite. The tools were limited, processes slower, answers deferred by the boundaries of that era. They had swept the building, collected every trace they could. Fibers, prints, soil samples, most of it led nowhere. A partial print smudged. A boot impression near the entrance that matched several brands. A single witness who had seen a light-colored sedan in the area that night. Nothing conclusive. Nothing that formed a path. He flipped to the second photo, a close-up of her hand. Her fingers slightly curled, fingertips dusted with faint dirt. No signs of a struggle in the room itself. The stillness had suggested she had been placed there, not harmed here. It was a transfer site, likely. That theory had shaped the entire early investigation. A soft creak sounded behind him as the building adjusted in the late morning heat. He didn't turn. The sound belonged to the structure, not to anything living. He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket, a reproduction of the one he had used in 2001. He kept these replicas for old cases, a way of stepping into the same mental rhythm he'd had back then. The pages were blank now, waiting. He wrote a single line. Scene unchanged, memory unchanged, review starts here. The simplicity steadied him. Across the room, near the far wall, he noticed something he hadn't seen in years. Not because it was new, but because he had forgotten its presence. A small hook screwed into the wall just above waist height. Nothing had been hanging from it when they found Daria. Nothing had ever been logged in relation to it. He stood and crossed the floor quietly, examining it from a closer angle. The hook was old metal, slightly rusted, fused into the drywall. He ran a gloved finger over its curve. It gave a faint vibration against the wall like an echo. He leaned closer. Around the hook, the paint had a faint outline, slightly lighter, almost imperceptible, as if something had once rested there for years, shielding the paint from sun fade. A framed item maybe, or a sign, something rectangular. He stepped back. Why had he never paid attention to that? Because back then the focus had been elsewhere, on the body, the entry points, the traces collected from the floor. The hook had seemed irrelevant. But now, in a case where every documented finding had already been reanalyzed, the irrelevant suddenly became its own form of direction. He returned to the table and opened the second half of the file. Recently processed reports, new lab results, updated testimonies from individuals re-interviewed after the case was reopened earlier this year. Among them was a statement from a former resident of the area, someone who had moved away in 2002 but returned briefly for a property sale last summer. A name that had reappeared unexpectedly: Miles Kerr. Caleb read the statement slowly. Kerr had lived near the edge of Reno in 2001, renting a converted storage building from the same property owner who used this abandoned structure. The two buildings weren't far apart. Kerr claimed he rarely came to this location, saying he had no reason to. The phrasing had struck the reviewing officer as vague, but not enough to raise alarms at the time. Now, after new testing on preserved samples had revealed a trace match to someone who had lived on that property, Kerr had been brought in quietly for questioning last week. The match was not definitive, but it was consistent enough to reopen the pathway. Caleb turned another page, a new detail, something small, easily overlooked, a fragment of a receipt recovered from the original evidence bag, stored with unrelated debris from the building floor. Only recently had it been examined again with updated imaging, a partial store name, a date, a timestamp. He lifted the sheet, holding it toward the window so the sliver of sun caught it at an angle. The corner of the paper held a faint set of letters. HARR could be part of a hardware store name, could be part of something else. But the date was the night before Daria had been found. He lowered the page, the weight in his chest shifting slightly. Logical possibilities lined up quietly in his mind. A hardware store near Reno operated under the name Harrison Supply in 2001. He remembered the place: pale brick exterior, 2 long aisles inside, fluorescent lighting that hummed on cold mornings. Local residents went there for routine items: nails, rope, tools, paint. Rope. He glanced again at the hook on the wall. The connection wasn't direct, just proximity possibility. But possibility was all an old case ever started with. A faint tap sounded against the doorframe behind him. He turned slowly. It was Officer Lyon Corbett, a recent transfer assigned to assist with reopened cases. She stepped into view with a careful, respectful quiet. "Anything?" she asked softly. He nodded once. "Maybe." The word was nearly silent. She didn't move farther into the room. "They confirmed the transport," she said. "He's being held. No schedule announced yet." Caleb absorbed the information without outward reaction. It fit the timeline. Care had been taken into custody after the new lab review, not charged, just held for further questioning. The official notice would be released soon. "Keep the notice sealed until we verify everything," he said quietly. Lyon nodded, then paused. "You want the updated photo logs?" "In a minute." She stepped back and her footsteps faded down the hall. The building returned to its slow breathing. Caleb sat again, the file open before him. He slid the receipt fragment to the center of the table. What mattered wasn't what it said, it was where it had been found. The original bag had contained dust, soil fragments, and small debris from the area near the wall hook. The fragment had been lodged in the folded corner of a larger piece of drywall scrap. It had been sealed for 2 decades, untouched. Meaning, whoever left that fragment had been in this room, near that wall, on that approximate date. He reached for the old scene diagram drawn by the first responder in 2001. A rough sketch, uneven lines, simple labels. He aligned it beside the photos. The wall with the hook was marked only as North Wall. No notes, no items logged. He studied the lines a long moment. Then something shifted in his memory, a detail from the property owner's original statement. Back then, the man had said the building was mostly used for farm storage, though he no longer remembered exactly what had been kept against each wall. One part of his statement stood out now, subtly. He had mentioned a hanging rack once attached to one of the walls. Caleb checked the transcript. There it was, one vague line. He wrote in his notebook, "Rack once present, removed by unknown person, timing uncertain." He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving a faint warmth in the cool air. This was how logic built itself, quietly, piece by piece. Nothing dramatic. Just alignment. He stared again at Daria's photo on the first page. Her gaze looked past the camera, steady, calm. He wondered what her last day had been like. Not the final moments, just the ordinary ones. The ones without weight. Something human remained in that thought. Something that mattered even after decades. He closed the file gently, then opened it again, as if resetting the act of reading from the start. The room stayed silent. He listened to it. He let the past breathe. The light shifted slowly across the floor as the sun climbed, stretching the thin band of brightness toward the far wall where the hook waited in its quiet place. Caleb studied it for several more seconds before stepping back to the table. He opened the archival envelope containing the supplemental photographs taken not by the department, but by a freelance shooter who had been on site that day in 2001 for a local paper. Most of those shots had never been used. They were too subdued for newsprint, too quiet to hold a headline. But quiet was exactly what Caleb needed now. He removed one print at a time, setting them face up in a deliberate grid. The photographs were softer than the official ones, slightly warmer color temperature, more ambient shadows, more attention to the room rather than the body. The photographer had worked like someone wandering through a memory, not documenting a report. In one frame, sunlight caught on a scatter of dust motes. In another, the empty doorframe looked both open and sealed. A few shots showed the wall with the hook, but taken at angles the department had not prioritized. He leaned over the photos, frowning slightly. One of them showed a faint rectangular shadow higher on the wall, aligned with the hook. The lighting was angled from the broken window back then, making portions of the wall appear uneven. But this photo revealed more contrast than the human eye had caught 20 years earlier. The shape was subtle, like the outline left when a picture frame is removed after years. He reached for the magnifier from his case. The lens caught a small flare as he adjusted it over the print. He studied the border carefully. The outline had sharper edges on the left side, slightly softer on the right. The bottom line was faintest, consistent with an object that had been removed recently relative to when the photo was taken. He wrote another note. Frame or board removed within months of scene date. Possible message, tool, or inventory piece. He set the magnifier down. A soft tapping echoed from somewhere in the building, loose metal against wood stirred by a warm breeze. Outside, distant traffic hummed in a slow, even rhythm. Nothing rushed here. Time itself seemed cautious. Caleb lifted another set of documents from the file, updated contact logs from the re-interview process. Several individuals from the old property records had been located. 3 were cooperative. 2 were uncertain. 1, Miles Care, had required travel assistance from another jurisdiction to even bring in for questioning. He turned to the page summarizing Care's early life. Born in Idaho, moved to Nevada at 19, worked a series of small jobs, carpentry, seasonal labor, occasional shifts at warehouses, never stayed long in one position. Descriptions from old neighbors painted him as quiet, reserved, solitary. Kept to himself, appeared more than once. In 2001, he had rented the converted storage building for 6 months. Records showed he purchased supplies from multiple stores, including Harrison Supply, common items, nothing specific noted. The receipts had faded, some were missing entirely. A few neighbors recalled seeing him carry framed boards in and out of his building. One remembered him sanding something in the evenings. When asked why, Care had told them he was fixing a project for someone. Caleb turned another page, a photograph of Care from last week's intake. The expression was blank, unreadable, the eyes distant, not defensive, just far away. He studied the image a long moment, then set it aside and reached for the older photos from the property owner's files. These showed the converted storage building Care had lived in. The structure had been cleared out after Care moved away, but a few items remained back then: random boards, an old metal rack leaning near the wall, and a small table. The metal rack caught Caleb's attention. Its shape was not identical to the hook in this building, but it had similar mounting points. He wrote in the notebook. He used frames, boards, racks, possible reused materials from other building. A short silence followed before he lifted the folder containing last week's updated analysis of trace particulates. New testing had revealed that a small fiber originally logged as unidentified textile now matched a category associated with a type of canvas backing used in hobby framing supplies sold at Harrison Supply around 2001. The store had stocked a limited set, one brand, one size option for mid-range customers. The kind that local residents bought when they needed simple framing for posters or paintings. Canvas backing. Art supplies. Daria had been an art student. His mind tracked the possibilities quietly, without letting any one theory run ahead of the rest. He returned to the original interview transcript with Daria's employer at the bookstore. The woman had said Daria would occasionally carry sketch portfolios to work, using her break time to draw quick studies of customers or storefronts. She often stopped at local supply shops, picking up small items. A neighbor had recalled seeing her walk home with a wrapped board under her arm shortly before the date on the receipt fragment. He closed the file slowly. The room felt even quieter now. He walked to the wall with the hook again. The outline looked faint but clearer now that he had seen the photographs. He imagined something framed hanging there. What had it held? A painting, a board, a sign from the property's earlier days. If the frame had been removed recently relative to the scene date, someone had taken it down not long before she was found. He stepped back to the table and began rearranging the photos, those from the original scene, those from the freelance shooter, and the newer reanalysis images. He arranged them by angle, by perspective, by light direction. A pattern emerged, not in the content, but in the absence. No photo showed anything lying on the floor near the hook except dust and debris. Nothing that hinted at a frame lying nearby. Nothing leaning. Nothing broken. He whispered under his breath, so it was never on the floor. A thought, not a conclusion. He returned to the page showing the canvas fiber analysis. The fragment matched a type used in mid-range frames. The kind that came pre-assembled with a thin backing and simple hook mounts. A frame like that could hold a drawing, a small print, or even a mounted board. He imagined someone removing it carefully, lifting it off the hook, carrying it out. Not breaking it, not discarding it, keeping it. He wrote, "Frame possibly removed on or near night of event. Person likely familiar with room layout." He set the notebook aside and closed his eyes briefly, not to rest but to reconstruct. The building in 2001. The clutter near the entrance. The faint tire marks outside. The morning light slanting through the broken pane. A deputy stepping aside to give him a clear path. The stark quiet when he first saw Daria there. He opened his eyes. He reached for the property owner's second interview, conducted just last month. The man, now older, had repeated that he barely recalled what had been in this building, but when pressed about the hanging rack, he had added a detail Caleb had missed in the first pass. He had once stored sample boards in here. Long rectangular pieces, lightly finished, used to display wood grain options for buyers. They had been hung on the wall for a few years before he moved them to another shed. Caleb read the line twice. Sample boards, rectangular, smooth. He stood again and approached the wall. He touched the hook lightly. The metal was cool. The outline was rectangular but slightly smaller than what large boards would leave, more consistent with a mid-sized frame or display piece. He returned to the table and examined the freelance photograph showing the outline. It was narrower than the sample boards the owner described. Not identical. He wrote, "Not sample board, personal frame." A thin breeze slipped under the door. Dust stirred in soft spirals. The building made a low creaking sound like a thought forming. He checked the file again. There was a section summarizing the few belongings found in Daria's apartment. Among them, notebooks, charcoal pencils, 2 small canvases, 3 sketch pads, and 1 framed board on her desk containing a half-finished landscape. But the report also listed a missing item, an additional framed board she had purchased earlier that week. It had not been found in her apartment, not at the bookstore, not at the scene. He circled the line. Missing framed board, never located. The outline on the wall was consistent, with the size described in the receipt from her purchase history. He leaned back in his chair, letting the realization settle without forcing meaning onto it. The framed board she purchased could have been intended for a new piece of art or for a class project. But if it had been taken, or if she had carried it somewhere on the evening she disappeared, its presence in this room became more than a detail. It became a question. He stood again, looking around the room as if expecting the answer to emerge from the dust. The light continued its slow crawl. Nothing altered. He returned to the table and opened a slim folder labeled Peripheral Statements. These were side interviews, secondary, minor at the time. One from a gas station attendant who recalled a quiet young woman buying a bottle of water and folding something under her arm. Another from a man walking his dog who thought he saw her cross the street with a rectangular object wrapped in brown paper. Neither had been confirmed. He wrote, "Last seen with framed item, destination unknown." He thumbed through another set of documents. This one contained Care's interview transcript from last week. His responses were short, calm, unrushed. When asked where he had been on the night of the date shown on the receipt fragment, he said he had been fixing something. When asked what, he said he didn't remember. The phrase bothered Caleb, not as accusation, just as mismatch. People might forget days, routines, conversations, but projects, boards, something they worked on physically. He placed the transcript on the table and considered the logic. Care had lived in the converted storage building during that time. The property owner had said he occasionally saw Care carrying framed boards, and the missing frame from Daria's belongings matched the outline on this wall. Still, logic required caution. Sequence mattered. Motive was irrelevant here. The investigation wasn't about assumptions. It was about patterns. He leaned forward again, eyeing the photos. The outline on the wall was clean enough to suggest something had hung there for a while before being removed. Not suddenly, not on impulse, which meant the frame might have been placed well before the scene date, possibly by the property owner, possibly by someone else entirely. He flipped back to the owner's early statements. He had used this room for storage until late 1999, when he shifted items elsewhere. Care didn't move nearby until mid-2000, so the frame could not have been hung by the owner in 2001. That left a narrower window, a year during which little activity happened here, except for occasional property visits. Caleb closed his notebook and let the room settle around him again. Nothing in the scene contradicted what he was building, nothing dramatic, just alignment, slow, certain, quiet. The investigation would now hinge on the frame, the missing object, the one that had never been recovered, never logged, never questioned. If located, it might carry residue, fibers, old dust. It might answer the outline on the wall. It might fill the gap between an old structure and a quiet young woman whose name still settled heavily in the air. He lowered himself into the chair once more, breathing steadily. The building remained silent. Not empty. Just waiting. The sun had climbed high enough that the thin beam of light no longer cut cleanly across the floor. It diffused now, softening the room instead of dividing it. The shift made the air feel heavier, as if the building was settling into itself, aware that the quiet was almost over. Caleb gathered the photographs into a neat stack and set them aside. He kept only the one showing the faint outline on the wall. He propped it against the edge of the table, letting it stand on its own. He turned to the box of secondary evidence logs, items not originally considered relevant. Old keys found near the doorway, a strip of weathered tape stuck to a crate, a few wood shavings from the floor. Back then, these had been sorted, bagged, labeled, and archived, then mostly ignored as background debris. Now he reviewed them with meticulous patience, lifting each sealed bag, turning it in the light, reading the original handwriting on the labels. One bag contained small remnants of a coarse fiber. They had been found near the wall hook, swept into the same collection as dust and plaster. The early lab notes said likely burlap. In that era, it was common for materials to be broadly categorized when no direct match was found. But last month, during the renewed analysis, those fibers were re-examined. The updated report labeled them as a rough weave backing consistent with protective wrapping material used for framed boards. He turned the bag in his hand slowly. The fibers were tiny, indistinct, almost weightless, but their meaning was not. If a framed board had been hung on that wall and later removed, protective wrapping could have been left behind, small fragments brushing off the edges, catching on the hook. Or it could have been from an object that had arrived wrapped and was unwrapped here. He placed the bag beside the photo. Next, he opened the section containing transcripts from the most recent interview with Care. The tone was neutral, his voice almost too steady. He answered questions with care. When asked if he had ever entered the abandoned building in 2001, he hesitated before saying he might have stepped inside once or twice. When asked what he was doing the week Daria disappeared, his answer was a flat, "I don't remember." When asked directly about framed boards, he said nothing at first, then replied, "I used to work with wood." Not evasive, not engaged, just distant. Caleb reviewed the lines again. Distance could hide uncertainty or something else, but the logic had to remain grounded. There was no room for projection, no place for assumption. He opened the final envelope in the file, one that had been sealed with a newer department tag. Inside were still images taken from the re-examination of the converted storage building where Care had lived. The building had changed hands many times since 2001, but a small locked storage compartment built into the back wall had never been removed. The current property owner had discovered it during renovation and notified the department. The compartment had contained old tools, a few scraps of metal, and several warped boards. Most were common, but one stood out, a mid-sized frame, slightly bent, with a thin canvas backing still attached. The frame matched the dimensions noted in Daria's purchase record. No artwork was inside. The board had been removed at some point. The backing was intact except for a small tear near the top. He held the photo of the recovered frame in his hand, comparing it silently to the wall outline. The proportions matched. The placement of the mounting bracket matched. Even the slight slant of wear on the upper edge appeared consistent. He set the photo down, steadying his breath. The recovered frame had been stored in the compartment for at least 2 decades. Dust patterns confirmed long-term undisturbed placement, but the heavier dust at the top edge suggested the frame had been stored face down, which meant the missing board, if once attached, would have been face to floor. He wrote a final note in his notebook. Frame located, board missing, connection probable. He closed the notebook without looking at the words again. He lifted the phone from his pocket and dialed the number for Officer Corbett. When she answered with a quiet yes, he spoke with the same low calm he had carried since entering the room. "I need the intake officer's log," he said, "and the new statement from the property owner's son." "I can bring them," she replied. "Just the scans," he said. "No need to come here." She understood, sending now. He set the phone down. A moment later, an alert sounded, a small chime too modern for the old building. He opened the file she sent. It contained the son's recollection of the old property inventory. He had been a teenager at the time, helping move items between buildings. He remembered sample boards, old equipment, and a stack of unused frames his father had acquired inexpensively from a supply chain clearance. Some were dented. Some had minor flaws. They had been stored in a shed, not here. But then the son added something small, almost casual. "I think someone took a few of those frames. They went missing that summer. My dad assumed they were borrowed. He didn't ask around." Caleb leaned back slightly. He let the details settle. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sharp. It simply aligned. Frames disappeared from one structure. A frame appeared years later in another one. And between those two structures lived a tenant who carried boards in and out, often working alone. He turned off the phone and remained silent for a long moment. He walked again to the hook on the wall. He traced its curve under the glove, feeling the cool metal. The outline on the wall no longer felt like a fading memory. It felt like a marker, a point in a sequence. Someone had hung that frame there, someone familiar with the room, someone who had access, someone who moved between the structures, someone who worked with wood, who used boards, who lifted frames without drawing attention. He stepped back, the logic aligned again, subtle as dust settling. He returned to the table and opened the scene photos, the one of Daria's hand, the one of her quiet posture, the one that showed the far corner where her shoe had rested, then the one taken by the freelance photographer, the shadowed outline of the absent frame. He spoke quietly, barely audible. You were here before she was. He didn't mean the frame itself. He meant the presence implied by it. He stood for a long time, letting the air settle around the realization. This was not a sudden twist. It was not contradiction. It was simply the conclusion shaped by small details allowed to breathe. A knock sounded at the doorway, soft, hesitant. He turned. Officer Corbett stepped inside with a careful nod. They confirmed, she said quietly. The transport is complete. He's being held until further review. Caleb acknowledged the information with a slight motion. Good. She looked around the room. Anything else you need? Not here, he said. This place has given what it can. She didn't step further into the room. She seemed to understand the weight of unspoken things contained in the air. If the board still exists, she said, we'll find it. He didn't answer immediately. He watched the dust drifting through the softened light, trailing slow paths that dissolved before reaching the floor. Finally, he said, maybe. She waited for more, but he didn't continue. She nodded once, then stepped out, leaving the building to its silence. Caleb remained alone in the room. He moved slowly, closing the file, sliding the photographs back into their envelopes, placing each item into the carry case. He worked with deliberate care, as though the objects could feel the weight of the years they had waited. When the last envelope was placed inside, he closed the case and rested his hand on it. The building creaked softly, as if shifting in relief. He walked to the center of the room, standing in the space where the outlined frame had once hung. He imagined the frame in place, imagined the board inside, imagined what had been drawn on it. Then he imagined nothing at all, an empty surface, blank, clean, untouched. The absence held its own tension. He let the thought fade. On his way to the door, he paused at the threshold. He turned once more, letting his eyes trace the room's contours, the dust-softened corners, the low beams, the faded marks from the early investigation. The quiet had its own texture now, not heavy, not sharp, just present. The past had not spoken, it rarely did, but it had aligned, offering shape without sound. He stepped outside into the dry Nevada air. The desert light was stronger out here, unfiltered, plain. The ground was warm, carrying heat from the hours before. A transport vehicle waited down the gravel path. Its presence was understated, unmarked. Just another quiet piece in a quiet conclusion. Caleb walked slowly toward his car, not hurried by procedure or time. Cases did not end because files closed. They ended when the mind allowed them to rest. And even then, a trace remained, dust on a fingertip, the outline of a frame, a name carried in silence. He reached his car and opened the door, setting the case on the passenger seat. Before closing it, he looked back once at the distant building. A simple structure, sun-worn, unremarkable. Yet it held a moment in time, suspended and unmoving, long after those who had shaped it had stepped away. He sat in the driver's seat, hands resting lightly on the wheel. He didn't start the engine immediately. He let the quiet settle again. Some answers were mechanical, procedures, steps, alignments. But beneath that, something human remained. Something that refused to be cataloged. Something that stayed with the investigator even after the case was marked complete. He breathed once, steady and calm. Then he turned the key. The engine started softly, and the dust behind him lifted in a slow, gentle rise, disturbed only for a moment before drifting back into its quiet place.